I want to round out these modules talking about the applications of learning. So what is training? What are the components of training? And how can we ensure that training within organizations basically mirrors what we know about human behavior and how humans learn? We'll talk a little bit about some more innovative reward systems that have been tried in some organizations to some success. And we're going to finally end with a little bit more on that idea of punishment through discipline. So within organizations, obviously, though we want to set up an environment that encourages positive behaviors, we want to make sure that we are rewarding positive behaviors. At the same time, there are going to be times where discipline is necessary in an organization. So we're going to talk about that as well. So beyond operant conditioning, which basically a lot of people react to a little negatively when we talk about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, is the concept of observational learning, the form of learning in which people acquire new behaviors by systematically observing the rewards and punishment given to others. In other words, one of the limitations of operant conditioning is that it is a very much a kind of behavioral method that focuses on immediate behaviors being immediately rewarded in some form. And honestly, it is mainly driven by how all higher animals learn. Observational learning, though, acknowledges that humans actually are far more complex than many of the creatures that have been used, specifically pigeons and rats, for basically operant conditioning studies. That doesn't mean that operant conditioning is not effective. It is. However, there are additional ways that people can learn that are not necessarily captured by operant conditioning, and one of those is observational learning. So observational learning is more of a social theory, the social psychological theory that basically looks at the steps in observational learning. And again, we can see some areas that we want to make sure are actually being followed if we want to promote observational learning. So the first thing is there has to be the behavior. So the behavior has to be being done by someone. So whatever the behavior is that we want people to learn, that behavior has to be demonstrated, whether it is a leadership style, whether it is operating a particular machine in a certain way. The next thing is the observer needs to pay attention to that behavior and remember what that behavior was. So one of the first things that we can think about when we're trying to set up observational learning is it isn't enough to just have someone demo how to behave. It's not enough to have someone show how to take an order or operate a machine or show how to give feedback. We need to make sure that we've set up an environment that highly encourages and motivates the person who is supposed to learn this behavior to pay attention to that model, to pay attention to that behavior, and to think about and remember what that behavior was. We then want to give the opportunity for them to practice that behavior. And again, the best way to do this, ideally, is to also have supervision to make sure the person is practicing perfectly. And what perfect practice means is practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. In other words, just doing something over and over again, if you're doing it wrong, guess what you're learning? You're learning how to do it wrong. So we need to make sure that when someone's practicing, there is some oversight in that process to make sure that they truly are following the behavior they initially watched. So we want to make sure that we're motivating the person to imitate the model and providing feedback. And finally, what we result in is the person now imitates the original model's behavior, and they're now doing it as well. So those are the steps in observational learning, and I hope you can see this is a little bit different than the direct application of reinforcements. It's about actually much more what we are used to as far as training more complex concepts. But this model also gives us some important information about how we can ensure the process is successful. And that's really what training is about. Training is the process of systematically teaching employees to acquire and improve job-related skills and knowledge. And the types of training can include all forms of actually pretty much anything that can provide this definition. So any systematic process which helps to teach skills is training. A lot of training can be classroom training, can be apprenticeship programs, can be cross-cultural training, executive training programs, e-training. The biggest thing to think about is the components of training. And what I mean by that is that we're going to talk about in the upcoming slides various elements that need to be a part of training to ensure that the training is effective for most people. Some of you probably learn the best from listening to my lectures, and I appreciate that. I'm glad that you're there listening. There are some of you, however, that probably really don't pay much attention to these lectures because you learn better by reading. Some of you are probably going to learn better when you have to write a paper or do a discussion. In other words, you learn better by engaging with the material. That's one of the reasons that a lot of modern classes at universities have multiple components. There is testing still, but there's usually lectures, there's reading, there's discussions, and there's papers. Those are all different methods of learning the material. All of them help us learn the material, but certain individuals are going to learn more from various elements. Now, think about it. If you didn't learn well from lectures, and this class had no discussions, no papers, and no reading, just lectures, you would probably struggle a little bit. It'd be hard for you to learn in that format. And that's one of the reasons that we provide multiple avenues, if you will, of education and training. In this case, training you about what we know of psychology and how it applies to the workplace. So let's talk a little bit more about those training components. The effectiveness to training is basically followed by these four main things. Four things we want to think about. The first one is participation. The more actively we can involve most people in the process of learning, the more active that participation is, it leads to more effective learning. Ever hear it's much easier to learn hands-on than through some book or presentation? That's what it means. The more we can have you engage with the material, whether it's just learning something through discussion and through writing a paper, or whether it's actually doing it in the case of some organizational skill, the more likely you are to get good at it. You can read book after book after book about coaching, but you'll learn more about actually providing coaching to someone the first time you ever actually try to coach someone. Now, those books are going to give you ideas, they're going to give you outlines, they're going to give you thoughts, but you've got to figure out what actually works for you, and that's usually going to be hands-on. So the more hands-on the training is, generally the more successful it is. A lot of organizations have actually tried to move towards a very high integrity in their training to where the training resembles the actual task or activity as much as possible. Whether that's role-playing or simulators, those are examples of trying to increase the participation and the active participation as a part of training. Repetition is another major part of successful training, the process of repeatedly performing a task so that it can be learned. So again, that kind of concept of over and over and over again. So I have the example here of Miyagi and Daniel-san in Karate Kid, where he's being taught to wax on and wax off, but he's also learning two basic moves of attack and defense in the martial arts. This repetition is important as well, and hopefully, again, most training is going to involve not only active participation, but participation in different ways where you are being asked to think about the material, listen about the material, read about the material, and engage with the material. The more you do all of these, the more likely it is that you'll actually learn. Now, when we're talking about actual effective training in organizations, we also really want to think about the transfer of training. The degree to which a skill learned during training actually is applied to performance in one job. One thing to do in practice, another to do it in the real world. So basically, the metric of whether training is successful in organizations is, do we actually see the behaviors that were trained occurring in the real workforce, and are those behaviors then resulting in higher success and performance? So when we design training, we're wanting to make sure there's a high level of participation and a high level of repetition. But when we evaluate training, we're mainly wanting to focus on, did it actually transfer to real skills that can be used in the workplace? And finally, training needs to be followed up by feedback, knowledge of the results of one behavior. Imagine if no one ever told you were doing it right or wrong. So once someone's trained, we also need to provide feedback. And this isn't feedback necessarily about the training itself. It's feedback about the skills. Are they performing those skills, and are they doing that at the level that the training was hoping for? So in other words, training doesn't end in the workplace at the end of the training session. There should also be an active process of feedback that follows the training. So let me talk briefly about some innovative reward systems that we're seeing in some organizations. Skill-based pay has been an idea that's been around for many decades, but we're seeing more and more interest in actually providing some form of, how do we measure skills instead of roles, and how do we base our pay system based on those skills? So a reward system which people are paid on the number of different skills they've learned relevant to performing one or more jobs in the organization. So for example, if you go to a workshop and learn how to do PowerPoint, you then start using PowerPoint in the organization, that's an additional skill. You'd actually get a raise based on that new skill. So the idea of skill-based pay is creating an actual reinforcement system, a reward system for learning new skills. The important part here is they need to be skills that are also organizationally relevant and result in the person being a higher performer in their role. Team-based rewards is another example of an innovative reward system in which employees are paid on the basis of their team performance. So again, if the team performs well, everyone on the team gets a reward. And remember in the previous module when we were talking about the importance of coming up with ways to reward positive behavior quickly, these are both two systems of trying to come up with either a bonus system or a pay system where the pay is no longer based on a moderate level of performance, basically meeting expectation, but pay is additionally based on actually rewards for learning new skills or performing well as a team. So we're going to end with basically the discussion of behavioral management with discipline. So discipline is the process of systematically administering punishment. And I already kind of touched on punishment in a previous model, that it is a little bit difficult to get successful punishment to function well in an organization. Generally speaking, most organizations use some form of progressive discipline, the practice of gradually increasing the severity of punishment for an employee who exhibits unacceptable job behavior. And this really is kind of, at its level, it is not necessarily 100% tied to just the psychological research. The psychological research would indicate that we want a fairly severe punishment fairly quickly, directly tied to the initial behavior. But what we find is that often that does not work in organizations, both for legal reasons, for moral reasons, and for also reasons of just expectations of our employees. So most systems of discipline are now progressive, and we're going to look at a couple examples of that. So disciplinary measures are usually on a continuum. So example, the most lenient to the most harsh. So for example, one might just be talking to the employee about the problem. Hey, we've noticed that you haven't been performing as up to expectations. What can we do to help you with that? If the person is still underperforming, giving an oral warning might be the second level. The third might be a written warning. The fourth might be to actually have a coaching session about the problem. The fifth might be provide special in-house services to help the employee, training for instance. Might then, 6, send the employee to a formal training session. 7, transfer the employee to a different department where maybe their negative behaviors wouldn't affect their performance. Intervene in the situation directly, put the employee on probation, withhold portions of merit pay, suspend without pay, and finally termination. So most organizations are going to create, again, going back to the second chapter, a communication system where it is very clear what the disciplinary measures are and what the process is. And the important thing to remember whenever we're talking about discipline is we are talking about the application of punishment within an organization. And there's a few things that we do know from psychological research on how punishment is either effective or not effective. And that's the last slide I'm going to end on for this particular session. So effective discipline the punishment needs to be delivered immediately upon undesirable response. So that means you also need to see the undesirable response to add the punishment. So we'll go with that very easy system of just talking to the employee. If someone behaves poorly, let's say that someone is supposed to do customer service with a smile. A manager observes them doing customer service kind of surly with no smile and kind of no social graces. Immediately calling the person aside and giving them that verbal, hey, that's not what we expect here, this is the behavior we expect, would be following this effective discipline line. However, if the person did this and it came to the management's attention 3 days later, and then 3 further days later, they called the person into their office, that's not immediate. That's where we start to see discipline kind of falling. It's less likely to be successful. Again, give moderate levels of punishment, nothing too high or too low. So again, if the person is very devoted to the negative behavior and really doesn't care if they're given a talking to, that's an example of punishment being too low. But we also don't want to start too high. So someone misbehaves, does something the company does not want to see, and the immediate response is to suspend them without pay. No one talked to them, there was no actual intervention, there was no effort to tell them what they were doing wrong. That's probably too high. It's one of the reasons for that graduated system of discipline. It's kind of allowing it to hopefully find the level that is at the moderate level. We want to make sure we're punishing the undesirable behavior, not the person. So it can be very hard not to attack the person doing the negative behavior, but it is more effective at changing behavior if we target the behavior, not the person. We want to make sure we're using punishment consistently across occasions. So if some people are being punished and others aren't for the exact same infractions, that's going to cause a major problem and probably much less success at changing the behaviors. We also need to make sure that the punish is equal for the same infraction across all people. And that's another reason for one of those systematic systems of discipline, is to be able to make sure that that punishment system is used the same across all people. Obviously, clearly communicate the reasons for punishment and also clearly communicate the level of punishment for various infractions. Make sure people know what the disciplinary policies are. And finally, do not follow punishment with non-contingent rewards. So what that basically means is the last thing that we want to do is bring someone in for punishment, talking to them, giving them a verbal warning, giving them a written warning. It is immediately followed by everyone getting a $100 raise or a $100 bonus. We want to make sure that we're not pairing our punishment with non-contingent rewards. So hopefully this gave you a very high level overview of what you're also reading about in the chapter for this particular module section. As always, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the discussion on Canvas or feel free to email me. And I look forward to talking to you next week.